In Bradford, October 1858, 20 people died after eating peppermint humbugs bought from a market stall. Over 200 more were poisoned, most of them children. The men responsible for it all walked free, not because the court showed mercy, because what they had done wasn't actually a crime, and at the center of the catastrophe was a substance so ordinary it sat on shop shelves next to sugar and flour. Arsenic. That was 1858, but the story of how a deadly poison became a fixture of nearly every Victorian home begins 2 decades earlier, in a Britain that hadn't yet worked out it was surrounding itself with it. Arsenic trioxide was nothing new by the time Victoria took the throne in 1837. It was a cheap byproduct of tin and copper smelting, and apothecaries had been selling it for generations, first as rat poison, then as a folk cure, then quietly as the preferred weapon of anyone who wanted a relative dead. Without a struggle, it had a nickname on the continent already: inheritance powder. It was odorless. It was tasteless. It dissolved in water without a trace. And in 1837, there was no law anywhere in Britain that stopped you buying as much of it as you wanted from anyone who sold it, for any reason you cared to give, or none at all. What was about to change wasn't the poison itself. It was the scale at which Britain started using it. In 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele had cooked up a brilliant new pigment from copper and arsenic, a green so vivid that nothing else on the market came close to it. For 60 years it had been a curiosity. In the 1840s, it became an industry. Wallpaper had always been a luxury, hand-blocked, expensive, something you'd find in a townhouse drawing room and nowhere else. That changed fast. Between 1839 and 1841, a firm called Potters of Darwin patented steam-powered roller printing, and the price of a roll of wallpaper collapsed. What had cost a labourer weeks of wages became something a shopkeeper or a clerk could afford. And the colour everyone wanted, the colour that outsold every other shade because nothing else was as bright or as cheap, was Scheele's green. Its more stable cousin, Paris green, followed soon after. Both were built from copper arsenite. Both were, chemically speaking, poison, hung on a wall. Nobody thought about that very hard in the 1840s, because arsenic wasn't yet a wallpaper problem in the public imagination. It was a murder problem. Through the decade, arsenic became the single most common poison used in domestic killings across Britain. It made grim sense. A few pennies bought enough to kill a grown man. It vanished into a cup of tea or a bowl of porridge without changing the taste. And until recently, there had been no reliable way to prove, after the fact, that it had been there at all. That last part had just changed too. In 1836, a chemist named James Marsh had developed a test that could detect arsenic in a corpse with a precision nothing before it could match. By the 1840s, the Marsh test was standard practice in British courtrooms, and juries that had once acquitted for lack of proof were now watching prosecutors produce arsenic residue on a slide. Forensic science had leapt forward. The law controlling who could actually buy the stuff in the first place had not moved an inch. This gap didn't only produce murderers, it produced accidents constantly in kitchens that had no idea they were dangerous. Arsenic trioxide is a fine white powder. So is flour, so is sugar, so are Epsom salts, so is baking soda. Shops kept them all the same way, on open shelves, in tins and paper twists that looked more or less identical to anyone in a hurry. Through the 1840s, coroner's inquests recorded case after case of arsenic mistaken for a kitchen staple, spooned into a meal, and only identified once someone was already dead or dying. This decision to sell a lethal poison exactly like an ingredient seemed like nobody's decision at all. It was simply how things had always been done. It was not harmless. By 1850 then, Britain had built itself a quiet trap. Arsenic was cheap, unregulated, and everywhere. In the murder statistics, in the mistaken identity poisonings, and increasingly on the walls of its more fashionable parlours. Something was going to force the country to notice. It arrived the following year, and it still didn't go far enough. Parliament finally acted in 1851 with the Arsenic Act. For the first time, anyone selling arsenic had to write the sale down. The buyer's name, their address, what they claimed they wanted it for. If the seller didn't personally know the buyer, a witness had to be present. And arsenic sold for ordinary domestic use, for killing rats mostly, now had to be dyed. mixed with soot or indigo, so it came out black or blue rather than a white powder that looked exactly like sugar. It was a real step. It was also full of a hole nobody had bothered to close. The Act said nothing at all about who was allowed to sell arsenic in the first place. There was no legal category yet for pharmacist or chemist. Any grocer, any ironmonger, any general shopkeeper in Britain could still stock arsenic on the same shelves as their sugar and their soap and sell it to whoever walked through the door. The register would tell you after the fact who had bought the poison that killed someone. It did nothing whatsoever to stop the sale happening in the first place. For 7 years, that was where things stood. A poison register that recorded tragedy after it happened, a dye requirement that only applied to some purchases, and a wide-open retail trade that put lethal quantities of arsenic within reach of anyone with a few pennies, and a plausible excuse. Then, in October 1858, all of that arrived on a market stall in Bradford, in the form of peppermint humbugs. The scheme that led there started small, and it started as fraud, not murder. A local confectioner named Joseph Neal wanted to cut costs on a batch of sweets, so he sent an assistant to a wholesale druggist to buy Daft, a cheap bulking agent, likely a form of plaster of Paris, used across the trade to stretch expensive sugar further. It was a common trick. It wasn't supposed to be a lethal one. The druggist, Charles Hodgson, was ill that day and left the counter to an assistant, a man most accounts name as William Goddard. Goddard went to weigh out the Daft. He drew it from the wrong drum. What he handed over instead was roughly 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide, virtually identical in appearance to the substance he'd been asked for. Neal, also apparently unwell, wasn't at the mixing himself to catch the mistake. The batch went ahead. Around 40 pounds of peppermint humbugs came out of it, laced through with enough arsenic to kill a village several times over. A street trader named William Hardaker, known locally as Humbug Billy, bought a share of the batch and set up his stall in Bradford's Green Market, selling the sweets loose, weighed out by hand from an open tray, exactly as every other sweet seller in Britain did every single day. There was no packaging, no ingredient list, no way on earth for a buyer to know what they were handing their child. Within days, people who had bought Humbug Billy's peppermints began collapsing, vomiting, cramps, collapse. The dead numbered around 20, most of them children, drawn to a stall selling penny sweets, because a penny sweet was a treat a poor family could actually afford. Over 200 more were poisoned and survived. Some estimates put the total closer to 220. 20 dead. 20 dead from a bag of sweets bought at a market stall for a penny. Hodgson, his assistant Neal, and Hardaker were all put on trial, and the case collapsed, not because the facts were in doubt. Nobody disputed what had happened, or that arsenic in the sweets had killed 20 people. It collapsed because in 1858 there was no law on the books that made it a crime to adulterate food with poison. Negligence? Yes, in the everyday sense of the word, but nothing that met the bar for a criminal conviction under the statutes as they stood. Every man walked free. 20 children and adults were dead, and the law had nothing to say about it at all. The Bradford case didn't stay a local story. Newspapers across the country picked it up, and they framed it inside a scandal readers already half recognized. Through the 1850s, a chemist named Arthur Hill Hassell had been publishing investigations, some of them in the Lancet, into just how routinely British food was being cut with fillers to save the cellar money. Chalk in bread, alum to whiten flour. Even the beer wasn't safe from tampering. Bradford turned that scandal from a matter of being cheated into a matter of being killed, and the public pressure that built afterwards was immediate and furious. If you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. We dig up hidden histories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, back to the story. Parliament moved fast by Victorian standards. Within 2 years of the deaths in Bradford, in 1860, Britain passed its first food safety statute, the Adulteration of Food or Drink Act. On paper, it made it an offence to sell food or drink adulterated in a way that would damage health. In practice, it was close to useless. Enforcement was optional, left to local authorities who had no obligation to bother with it, and the penalties on offer barely stung. Through the 1860s, prosecutions under the Act were rare to the point of vanishing. 20 people had died in Bradford, and the law Britain built in response couldn't be bothered to enforce itself. While that toothless statue sat on the books doing almost nothing, arsenic's other great Victorian career was reaching its peak. Scheele's green, and its tougher, longer-lasting cousin Paris green, had become the defining colour of British interiors through the 1850s and 60s. It wasn't just wallpaper, though wallpaper was where it did its greatest business. The same copper arsenite pigment turned up in dress fabric, in artificial flowers pinned to hats and bodices, in the paint on children's toys, even printed into the pages of children's books. If a Victorian object needed to be vividly, unmistakably green, the odds were good that arsenic was what made it so. No dye made from plants or minerals could match its brightness, and nothing else came close to its price. Among the firms selling that green into fashionable drawing rooms from 1861 onward was Morris & Colton, founded by a designer named William Morris. Morris built his reputation on a very particular idea, that beautiful, honestly made objects for the home were a kind of moral good, a rebuke to cheap industrial ugliness. His wallpapers, hand-blocked and richly patterned, became some of the most sought after in Britain. And green, his arsenical green, was among his signature colours. Here's the part of the story that doesn't fit the reputation. Morris wasn't just selling arsenic-tinted paper. He had a direct financial stake in the arsenic itself. His father had been an early investor in a copper mine near Tavistock in Devon, called Devon Great Consols, and Morris inherited shares in it. By the 1860s and 70s, that mine had become, by a wide margin, the largest arsenic producer on Earth, supplying something like half the world's output, much of it shipped to the United States to kill cotton pests. At its height, it employed over 1,000 workers. And from the 1870s, William Morris didn't just hold shares in it. He sat on its board as a director, drawing a steady income from a business built entirely on digging the world's arsenic out of the Devon hillside. This was a man who preached honesty and craft, who called himself a socialist, who built his entire public identity on the idea that art should serve ordinary people rather than exploit them. And underneath that identity sat a substantial, ongoing fortune, drawn from the mineral that made his most popular wallpaper so vivid, and that was, at the very same time, starting to poison the people who lived surrounded by it. Because through the 1870s and 80s, doctors began putting a name to something they'd been seeing in specific households for years. A physician called Dr. Thomas Orton published case studies linking illness, chronic sickness that came and went with no obvious cause, directly to homes decorated in arsenical green wallpaper. The working theory was that damp British walls, behind coal fires and with next to no ventilation, allowed a mold to grow on the arsenic-laced paper, and that the mold converted the pigment into a toxic gas that seeped into the room. Contemporaries described a faint, unpleasant smell in the worst affected rooms. People called it mousy. Nobody yet had the chemistry to prove exactly what was happening. But room after room, the same pattern kept turning up. The fashionable green paper, the persistent, unexplained sickness in the household living beside it. William Morris was told about this directly, more than once, and when he was pressed on the danger of the wallpaper carrying his own name, he didn't investigate. He dismissed it. In a letter written in 1885, challenged on exactly this point, Morris wrote that the doctor sounding the alarm had been bitten, as people were bitten by the witch fever, comparing genuine medical concern to a historical bout of mass hysteria. He kept his shares in Devon Great Consols. He kept drawing his director's income, and Morris and Cozier kept selling arsenical wallpaper for years afterward, even as some rival manufacturers had already begun quietly moving away from the pigment under the same pressure Morris waved off as superstition. This is where the story stops being about careless shopkeepers and starts being about a man who knew exactly what the question was and chose again and again not to answer it honestly. While Morris collected his dividends from a comfortable distance, the people actually producing his arsenic paid for it in their own bodies. Down in Devon and across the Cornish tin country, miners worked the arsenic seams in conditions that left visible marks. Chronic exposure to arsenic dust and fumes brought on skin ulcers so common among the workforce that they had their own name, arsenic holes, open sores that ate into the skin of hands, arms and faces and simply never fully healed. Respiratory damage was routine. Elevated rates of illness and early death followed the mining districts the way smoke follows a chimney. These were not the fashionable people buying green wallpaper for a London drawing room. These were the men who dug the raw material out of the ground for a wage, while a director 100 miles away banked the profit. It wasn't only the miners. In the factories that turned raw arsenic into pigment, much of that dry, dangerous mixing work fell to women and girls, standing over vats and trays of arsenical powder, breathing green dust for a working day at a time. The same ulcers turned up on their hands. The same chronic sickness followed them home. Nobody was paying them a director's fee for the privilege, and here is the detail that makes the scale of all this land properly. The fatal dose of arsenic trioxide for an adult sits somewhere between 100 and 200 milligrams. That's a pinch smaller than a single sachet of sweetener on a cafe table. A quantity you could lose in the crease of your palm was enough to kill a grown man. Multiply that by the pounds and pounds of it, moving through mines, factories, wholesale druggists, and market stalls across Victorian Britain every single year. And the wonder isn't that Bradford happened. The wonder is that it didn't happen more often. Arsenic wasn't only something Victorians were exposed to by accident or industry either. Some of them swallowed it on purpose, and did so knowingly, chasing a very specific idea of beauty. Reports circulated of arsenic eaters, women who built up a tolerance to the poison through small regular doses, seeking the pale, luminous, faintly fragile complexion that Victorian taste prized above almost any other look. Arsenic dilates the blood vessels near the skin's surface. Taken carefully, in small enough amounts, it produced exactly the rosy pale glow fashionable women were chasing, and that effect alone was enough to keep them coming back for more dose by dose, in a habit that was, by any modern description, a slow and voluntary poisoning undertaken in pursuit of fashion. The clock, though, was already ticking on something else, because while Morris dismissed the doctors and the arsenic eaters chased their complexions, the same substance that had let 20 people die in Bradford without a single conviction was about to force Britain to answer a much bigger question. Not just who was allowed to sell arsenic, but whether the entire trade in cheap, adulterated, poisoned food and household goods could keep operating the way it always had. The people responsible for Devon Great Consols and Morris and Colsates couldn't hear it yet, but the reckoning wasn't far off. The reckoning arrived in pieces, spread out over a decade, rather than in one clean sweep. In 1868, Parliament passed the Pharmacy Act, and for the first time in British law, it created an actual legal category. The pharmaceutical chemist. Only registered pharmacists could now sell arsenic and a defined list of other poisons. It had taken 17 years since the Arsenic Act, and 10 since Bradford, to close the loophole that had let any grocer or ironmonger stock deadly poison next to the soap and the sugar. A child could no longer walk into any shop in Britain and buy enough arsenic to kill a household. It had simply taken until 1868 for anyone to close that door. Food regulation crept forward the same slow way. The 1860 Act had proved worthless, so in 1872 Parliament passed the Adulteration of Food, Drink and Drugs Act, tightening the language but still without the machinery to make it bite. That machinery finally arrived in 1875 with the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, the reform historians generally treat as the true foundation of British food safety. It required local authorities to appoint public analysts, gave them real power to test what was actually being sold, and backed it with penalties that meant something. 17 years after Humbug Billy's stall in Bradford's Green Market, Britain finally had a food safety system with teeth. The wallpaper question resolved differently, and more slowly still because nobody ever passed a law to settle it. In 1893, an Italian chemist named Bartolomeo Gosio identified the actual mechanism doctors like Orton had been circling for years, a fungus that could grow on damp arsenic-laced wallpaper and convert the pigment into a toxic gas released into the room. It's still known today as Gosio gas, but even with a named mechanism, Parliament never banned arsenical pigment in wallpaper, fabric or paint during Victoria's reign. What killed Scheele's green in the end wasn't legislation. It was fashion, medical publicity, and the arrival of safer synthetic dyes that could finally compete on price. By the 1890s, the once inescapable color was falling out of commercial favor, phased out by the market rather than outlawed by the state. And here's where the story gets less tidy than it first appears. The popular version of this history says Victorian Britain unknowingly wallpapered itself to death, and it's worth pausing on how much of that is actually proven. Bradford is not in dispute. 20 people are dead on the historical record from a specific bag of sweets sold on a specific October afternoon in 1858. The Wallpaper claim rests on something thinner, a handful of case studies, a plausible chemical mechanism from Gosio, and modern testing using X-ray fluorescence on surviving Morris & Co.'s wallpaper samples, which has confirmed real significant arsenic content in the pigment itself. What's missing is a body count. No register of the dead exists for arsenical wallpaper the way one exists, however roughly, for Bradford. Some historians argue the wallpaper panic was real but disproportionate. More a moral panic about a fashionable, faintly disreputable shade of green than a proven mass killer with a death toll to match. Which leaves William Morris sitting at an uncomfortable fault line that his own money never let him occupy neutrally. Was he a profiteer who chose not to look too closely at the doctors raising the alarm? Or was he, given the thin and inconclusive evidence actually in front of him at the time, not unreasonable to think the alarm overblown? It's a genuine question. But his director's income from the largest arsenic mine on earth means his own answer to it was never going to be a trustworthy one. Whichever way the truth eventually falls, if you've stuck with this one this far, you clearly like a story where the villain isn't a monster in a cape, but a respectable man who talked himself out of an inconvenient truth. Hit subscribe, because we've got plenty more of those coming. Now, let's finish this one. Even as the wallpaper faded from fashion, arsenic never actually left the Victorian home. It just retreated from the walls and back into the medicine cabinet, where it had been quietly sitting the whole time. Fowler's solution, a preparation of potassium arsenite, remained a mainstream doctor-prescribed medicine right through to the end of the century, dispensed for anemia, for skin disease, even for asthma. Physicians who would never have dreamed of hanging arsenical green in a nursery were still writing prescriptions for patients to drink diluted arsenic by the spoonful, because in the form of medicine, the same substance somehow read as safe. And into the 1890s, right up against the edge of Victoria's reign, arsenic complexion wafers were still being advertised and sold to fashionable women chasing exactly the pale, luminous look the arsenic eaters had always been after. 60 years after Victoria took the throne, in a Britain that had passed a Pharmacy Act, an Adulteration Act, and a Sale of Food and Drugs Act specifically to get poison out of unsuspecting hands, a woman could still walk into certain shops and buy arsenic to eat on purpose for her skin. Decorative arsenic had been driven out by fashion and synthetic dye. Ingested arsenic simply never went away at all. It's worth sitting with what William Morris's fortune actually looked like next to an ordinary Victorian household, because the gap is what makes his dismissal of the doctors land as more than just stubbornness. A comfortable professional income in Victorian Britain ran somewhere between £300 and £1,000 a year. Morris, through his shares and his director's seat at Devon Great Consols, drew dividend income that ran into the tens of thousands of pounds across his lifetime, an amount that placed him not among the comfortable, but among the genuinely wealthy, built almost entirely on a mine supplying roughly half the arsenic used anywhere on Earth. Every doctor he waved off as a victim of witch fever was, in effect, asking him to consider giving some of that up. He never did. There's one more thread worth pulling, because it shows how far the arsenic story reached even into the household of the monarch herself, though it comes with a caveat historians attach more firmly than to almost anything else in this story. It's often repeated that in 1879 arsenical wallpaper was stripped from guest rooms at Buckingham Palace after a visitor there fell ill. The story circulates widely. The sourcing behind it is thin, and it should be treated as an illustrative anecdote rather than settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is this: whether or not the specific Buckingham Palace story holds up, the fact that it could plausibly be told and believed says everything about how deeply arsenic had worked its way into Victorian domestic life, right up to the very top of it. By the time you reach the closing years of Victoria's reign, the shape of who met arsenic, and how, had settled into something close to a class map of Britain itself. A wealthy household could paper an entire drawing room, and often the nursery next to it, in the vivid arsenical green that had once been the height of fashion, encountering the poison through decoration, through choice, through taste. A poorer household, even after mechanization had driven the price of wallpaper down, was still far more likely to meet arsenic through the food on its table than through the walls around it. Wallpaper, cheaper than it had ever been, was still a marker of some comfort. Adulterated food was not. Cheap bread cut with alum, cheap sweets cut with the wrong drum of powder, cheap beer stretched with whatever the brewer could get away with. These were exactly the goods bought by families with the least money to spare and the least power to complain when something went wrong. The Bradford dead were not customers of Morris & Cole's. They were customers of a market stall selling penny sweets, because a penny was what they had. That divide runs underneath the entire 70 years of this story, without ever once being written into law. Nobody in Parliament sat down and decided that the rich would be poisoned by their own good taste, while the poor were poisoned by their own poverty. It simply worked out that way, because arsenic was cheap enough and common enough to find its way into whichever version of Victorian life you happened to be living. It did not discriminate in where it turned up. It discriminated quietly and completely in who had the money to avoid it and who didn't. What the Bradford poisoning actually looked like up close is worth sitting with, because the newspaper column inches never fully capture it. The arsenic in those humbugs wasn't a faint contamination. Each sweet carried a dose many, many times what it took to kill an adult, packed into a treat sized for a child. The vomiting came on fast. So did the cramping, the collapse, the desperate house calls from doctors who, within hours, were seeing the same symptoms arrive again and again from families who had no connection to one another, beyond a shared visit to the same stall in the Green Market. Word spread through Bradford before the authorities had even finished counting the dead. And once the town understood what had happened, it needed somewhere to put its fury. That somewhere became William Hardaker. Humbug Billy hadn't mixed the arsenic. He hadn't weighed it, sold it as daft, or missed the fatal batch in front of him. He'd bought sweets from a supplier in good faith and sold them exactly as he sold sweets every other day of his working life. None of that mattered to a town burying its children. Hardacre was publicly named, publicly blamed, and by most accounts hounded afterward by a community that needed a face to put to the horror, even though the actual point of failure sat 2 steps up the supply chain, in a druggist's shop he'd never even visited. It's a bitterly familiar shape. The man at the very end of the chain, the one closest to the public, closest to the children who died, absorbed the blame that should have landed on the mistake made further back and higher up. The scale of that batch is easy to state and hard to actually picture, so it's worth doing properly. 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide is roughly the weight of a large bag of household flour, tipped whole into a mixing bowl meant for sugar. Stirred through it was 40 pounds of sweets, enough to fill several large sacks, enough for a street trader to sell from his stall for days. Every single one of those humbugs, weighed out by hand, 1 penny's worth at a time, carried a dose of poison many times over what it took to kill the person eating it. A market stall in Bradford, on an ordinary October morning, was handing out death by the tray, and nobody serving it, buying it, or eating it had the faintest idea. The exact toxicology of it came out at the inquest, and it's the sort of detail that makes the tray of death image scientifically precise rather than just vivid. Investigators estimated each individual humbug carried several grains of arsenic trioxide, a dose reckoned at dozens of times what it took to kill a healthy adult, let alone a child small enough to fit 2 or 3 sweets in one closed fist. A grain is a tiny unit, barely a speck on a set of apothecary scales. It didn't matter. Dozens of fatal doses, stacked into a single sweet the size of a thumbnail, meant there was no such thing as a safe humbug in that batch, no lucky sweet that happened to miss the contamination. Every single one pulled from those 40 pounds was, on its own, capable of killing the child who ate it. What made the arsenic eaters more than a rumour was where the habit had actually been observed and written up by doctors who went looking for it. Reports came out of Styria in the Austrian Alps, describing local peasant women and mountain labourers who ate arsenic openly. As a matter of ordinary practice, building tolerance the way a drinker builds tolerance to spirits. They started with doses too small to do visible harm and worked upward, a pinch at a time, over months and years, until they could swallow amounts that would have dropped an untrained person on the spot, Fashionable Victorian women in Britain never had access to a formal tradition quite like it. No local apothecary willing to guide a customer through a careful, escalating regime the way the Styrian habit was said to work. What they had instead was word of mouth, guesswork, and a genuine willingness to gamble with a poison, one small dose at a time, for the sake of looking pale enough to be considered beautiful. It's worth pausing on how strange that trade actually was. A woman risking organ damage, risking her own death by miscalculated dose, in pursuit of a complexion that read, to Victorian eyes, as fashionably fragile rather than as what it actually was, the visible sign of slow, deliberate poisoning. The industrial side of the story deserves the same close attention, because over 1,000 workers is a number that's easy to read past. Picture a workforce of that size gathered in one place, and you're picturing something close to the entire working population of a small Victorian town, all employed by a single company, all drawing their wage from a single product. That was Devon Great Consols at its peak. Not a modest local pit, but an operation on an industrial scale, its shafts and processing sheds running day and night to keep pace with the Britain and a wider world that couldn't get enough arsenic. The ore came up from underground thick with mineral dust. Roasting it to extract the arsenic trioxide released fumes that hung over the processing sheds and drifted across the surrounding countryside, settling on the fields, the cottages, and the lungs of everyone living downwind. Workers who spent their shifts closest to the roasting process were the ones who developed the worst of the arsenic holes, the skin ulcers that marked out a miner's trade almost like a uniform. A man could walk through a Tavistock street in the 1860s and read a stranger's occupation off the state of his hands. None of that showed up in the accounts William Morris actually saw. What he saw was a dividend check, arriving with the punctual regularity of any well-run investment, disconnected by 100 miles of English countryside from the shafts and the roasting sheds that produced it. That distance is not incidental to the story. It is the story. It is the exact same distance that let a fashionable woman in a London drawing room admire her green wallpaper without once wondering about the miner in Devon, whose skin was breaking down to make the pigment possible, or the factory girl breathing the dry green dust that gave the paper its colour. Money has always been good at manufacturing that kind of distance. Arsenic, in Victorian Britain, simply made the distance unusually literal, unusually measurable, and unusually deadly at both ends of it. That same distance ran through the textile trade too, in a shop most fashionable Victorian women would never have thought to ask questions about. Dressmakers and dye-house workers handling arsenic green fabric spent their days with the pigment on their hands, and in the air around them, dyeing yards of muslin and silk gauze that would end up as ball gowns and evening dresses in the grandest rooms in London. Reports from the period described dye-house workers developing the same skin ulceration seen in the mines, along with persistent sores around the nose and mouth from breathing the dust off freshly dyed cloth. A wealthy woman wearing an arsenical green gown to a ball risked very little herself, since the pigment was bound into the dye rather than loose on the surface. The seamstress who had cut and stitched that gown, hour after hour, with green dust settling into the fabric of her own working dress, was a different matter entirely. The glamour and the harm were once again never in the same room together. Toy manufacturers worked the same pigment into a different kind of product, and the audience for the risk got younger still. Green-painted tin soldiers, wooden building blocks, papier-mâché animals and picture books with hand-coloured illustrations all drew on the same cheap, vivid copper arsenite that coloured the wallpaper. A toy didn't have to be eaten to be dangerous. A child mouthing a painted block or running a thumb along a page and then putting that thumb between their lips was picking up a measurable dose of arsenic with each small, unthinking habit that every parent in Britain would have recognised and none would have worried about. Picture books were worse again because they were handled constantly, page after page, night after night, by exactly the readers small enough to be most vulnerable to what was on them. Nobody manufacturing those books set out to poison a nursery. They simply reached for the brightest, cheapest green available, the same one going onto the walls around the child's bed, without asking why it was so much cheaper than any alternative. That question of why arsenic pigment undercut everything else on the market so completely has a blunt answer once you follow the supply chain back to its source. Arsenic trioxide wasn't manufactured on purpose so much as it was a byproduct The leftover material skimmed off during the smelting of tin and copper ore that mines like Devon Great Consols were already processing for entirely different metals. It cost the mine owners next to nothing extra to produce, because the furnaces were burning anyway, and the arsenic came off as a matter of course. A pigment built on a waste product will always undercut a pigment built from scratch, and that single fact of industrial chemistry is the real reason arsenic green blanketed Victorian Britain as thoroughly as it did. It wasn't chosen because anyone loved the colour more than any other shade of green achievable by other means. It was chosen because nothing else came close on price, and price, in a century built on mass production and thin margins, beat almost every other consideration on the table. It was in the wallpaper on the nursery wall. It was in the sweets sold from a market stall for a penny. It was in the powder a woman dabbed onto her cheeks to look beautiful and swallowed to look paler still. It was in the dividend check of a man who called himself a socialist and told the world to distrust its own doctors. It killed without a knock at the door, without a struggle, and for most of Victoria's reign, without breaking a single law. Walk into a museum today, and you can still stand in front of a genuine William Morris wallpaper sample, framed behind glass, admired for its craftsmanship. Test it under X-ray, as modern chemists have, and it comes back exactly as it would have 150 years ago, still full of arsenic, still quietly poison. The Victorians didn't need a villain twirling a moustache to poison their own homes. They just needed a price list, and enough people willing not to look too closely at what was on it. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us this. If arsenic was sitting on the shelf next to the sugar in the wallpaper and in the sweets, would you have spotted it before it was too late? And give this video a like so more people can find it.